Hello, everyone, and welcome to Houston Techfest 2020, the virtual edition. Before we get started, I want to make you aware of a feature in the presentation that will make the session more interactive. Please take note of the question mark icon on your presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which will allow you to send the moderator questions, that's me, to be delivered to the presenter at the appropriate time. So feel free to post anytime during the session. We're excited to let you know that CodeMag will be giving a free subscription. I'll be posting a link in the Q&A section with that announcement. We are proud to present Otto, who will be presenting Blazor client side versus server side. Go ahead and take it away, Otto.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. Yeah, we will be talking about Blazor today. Little introduction about Blazor and see what the differences are between client-side and server-side Blazor. A little bit about me before I start. I'm with EPS Software and Code Consulting. I'm a senior software developer. I'm also a professor at the University of Houston. This is also where I got my PhD in computer science from. I've done quite a few publications in scientific journals, at conferences. I've been presenting at Techfest a couple times, and I have publications in our Code magazine, which, as you just heard, you can get a free subscription from if you follow that link that will be posted. Other than that, in my free time, if I'm not coding, I'm lifting a lot of weights, and I'm currently a United States Powerlifting Association Texas state record holder. That's all about me. We're going really quick over what code is. Well, Code Consulting or EPS Software, we're doing a lot of custom software development, training consulting, from anything from .NET, SQL servers. We are doing a lot of Fox Pro conversion from legacy apps. So if you have or know of anybody who has any needs or need some help with any of these projects, feel free to contact us. Not only do you get the free Code magazine subscription, you can also get a free 1-hour consulting from us if you contact us. So keep us in mind if this is something that you would like to take advantage of. Now, the agenda for today, we're going to talk obviously about Blazor. First, we're going to talk about what is it. We're going to look at the two different types of development you can do with Blazor. You can do client-side Blazor or server-side Blazor. Then we're gonna ditch the theory and go a little bit into coding. We're gonna do just, I mean, obviously we only have less than an hour, so we're not gonna do giant project, but we're gonna do a little sample project where we create a project where we add something to the sample project that Visual Studio creates for you if you create a new project. And then we're gonna deploy it to Azure, and we're going to see it live as a live website, how it behaves and how client-side Blazor app compares to a server-side Blazor app once it's deployed. And then we're going to have a little Q&A in the end, so time permits. Types of Blazor, what is it? Well, to begin with, it's an interactive web UI with C#. That's really the biggest news about Blazor. It's C#, right? You're no longer dependent on JavaScript. It's very similar to other SPA frameworks. It's building reusable components. But in this case, instead of JavaScript, we're using C# in combination with HTML and CSS. You can run it directly in the browser using WebAssembly. This is, yeah, actual real .NET. It's using existing .NET libraries. You can create your own .NET libraries. You can reuse .NET libraries you have used before in other .NET projects. And, well, it can run on the server or it can run on the client side. The cool thing about this, and we'll see that later in our demo as well, it's using the same code. So if you want to deploy it as a client-side app or as a server-side app, you do not have to rewrite your application. Now, we'll see that it's not just as easy as to turn a switch and, you know, switch it over from client-side to server-side. So it's not that easy. It's not a one-click change. But it is simple enough to, you know, say, yeah, it is the same code, and you'll see it is exactly 100% the same code. The differences, as you'll see, is just in architectural nature of the project. And Blazor also allows you to do JavaScript interop. If you have libraries or if you have controls or code that you have used before in other projects and other websites that are in JavaScript, and that either you don't want to rewrite or it's a library that just doesn't exist yet in Blazor. I mean, because Blazor is still fairly new, right? It just came out as a full stack option this year. You can reuse those, right? You can reuse your JavaScript tools, your JavaScript libraries, and communicate with them through Blazor with JavaScript interop. Now, a few details on client side, what to expect, what can we see in client side that is different to server side. In client side, we have obviously the nature of a single page application framework. The biggest deal here is that we're dealing with WebAssembly code in the final form, so to say. What is WebAssembly? We're abbreviating it with WASM. It's optimized bytecode format, and it's open standard that runs without plugins. To talk about optimized bytecode format, we have to, think of it as optimized in execution time as well as optimized in space that it occupies. So it's a twofold optimization, really. And the open standard means that every modern browser can run it without having to download or install any plugins. Now, as we'll see in the direct comparison later, that that also means there's a few browsers that will not understand WebAssembly, that you cannot run Blazor apps in. Those are, for example, thin clients or browsers that are not one of the big 5 or 6, or however many we have. In other words, you probably are not able to run a Blazor app on your smart fridge, if you want to look at it that way. You do have in Blazor full browser functionality. So anything the browser offers you, all access and so on, is available to you in Blazor. And that is through the JavaScript interop. Because in essence, the WebAssembly runs in the browser's JavaScript sandbox. So anything that you used to be able to access through JavaScript, you're still able to access through Blazor. Just another layer of communication in between. The way it works is when you create your Blazor app is you write C# code, right? Obviously, that's the cool thing about Blazor. And you have your Razor files, and you produce .NET assemblies. These .NET assemblies plus the .NET runtime together are then downloaded from wherever your website is hosted to the client to be run in the browser. Now, when we look at the pros and cons of each side, we'll see that, there is a big con to it, and that is that this download is always at least a minimum size, because you always have to have the .NET runtime downloaded. However, your browser can help you with that as well. There is the option for your browser to cache that, so not every single time you open it, you have to re-download it again and again. So there's a few tricks your browser and Blazor does to alleviate some of these problems. Then WSM bootstraps the .NET and loads the assemblies that were created from your Razor components. And then WebAssembly uses JavaScript interop for DOM manipulation and does your browser API call. So this is basically how the communication between the DOM and your Blazor app works if you have your Blazor app running client side. On the other hand, if you have your Blazor app running server side, you have your Razor components hosted in a ASP.NET Core app server side, right? So in essence, it's very similar to a standard ASP.NET Core app that's running on Azure maybe, or maybe Amazon. Whatever cloud service you want to use, you can host your Blazor app at. And then once your app is hosted and is running on your server, you have a SignalR connection between the client and between the server. And this SignalR connection handles all the UI updates and all the input communication between the server and the browser. It also does all the JavaScript interop calls. So whenever you have anything that your browser or your browser API needs. All of this goes through the Signal connection from your client to your browser, to your server, back and forth. Now, when you decide to make a Blazor app, you always have to weigh in your options on which one of those options, server side or client side, are you going to go with? Because you can't just out of the blue decide I'm going to do a client side app for this project or a server side app for that project if you're unaware of the implications that has once the app is deployed and available to the tens, hundreds, thousands, or millions of users. I don't know what project that might be, but always depends on what you're doing, which option you should take. If you have a client-side Blazor application, for instance, well, you have .NET running directly in the browser, and that allows you to say, well, I can be a full stack C# web developer, right? Before Blazor, that wasn't the case. Before Blazor, to be a full stack web developer, you at least had to do some JavaScript work in order for your full stack to be developed, right? Right now, with Blazor, you can do full stack, front end, middle tier, back end development, everything in C#. Another pro or advantage of client-side Blazor is that it is, in theory, faster than JavaScript because it's pre-compiled into WebAssembly before it's executed in the browser. Now, this advantage is to take with a grain of salt because it completely depends on your implementation and the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve with code. It is in theory, yes, if you have code that is written in the best possible way in C# and then pre-compile into WebAssembly, and you have the equivalent code written in JavaScript, yes, it probably is faster executed in WebAssembly. But as we'll see, there is certain things that play a role in that, and that is, for instance, you do have coding practices that are not 100% perfect. If you implement your problems a little differently than you should, it completely depends on the nature of your implementation, whether you can take full advantage of that or not. So you really have to know what you're doing, in other words, to take advantage of that advantage. One of the other big pros of client-side Blazor is that it does work offline, and you have Progressive Web App or PWA option as a deployment. What that is, it allows you to say my website or my web app can be installed as a PWA on a mobile phone, for instance. And if I do not have internet connection, you can still use the app and provide functionality that runs local, because the entire app is downloaded, right, onto your phone, onto your desktop, wherever you run this. And if you want to do so, you can implement a routine, for instance, that checks off for internet connection. If you do not have internet connection, it provides functionality to run offline. Obviously, nothing can go to or from a database at that point, but you can cache stuff, right? You can cache input, you can cache output calculations, whatever. And then as soon as the app notices, hey, internet is back, you can sync that cached data that you have back to the server and allow the user in that manner to have an app that works both online and offline. This is obviously not possible with any web application that has a server side that does all the logic. The big con of Blazor client side is, first of all, the whole runtime needs to be downloaded, right? So even if you create a empty project, or let's say a Hello World project, you will have a few megabytes to download even for that, because the entire runtime needs to be downloaded, plus the assemblies that were created through or from your Razor pages. It is not that big of a deal in most cases, because internet isn't slow in most cases anymore. Most people have a pretty decent internet connection. So downloading 3 megabytes or 4 isn't that big of a deal. If that is around the size of the runtime that you have to download. However, sometimes when you are in remote places or places where you have not that good of an internet connection, it can take a little bit longer. I mentioned before, there is a few things that are done to alleviate that, and that is that this runtime can be cached by your browser. So every single time you open the page, it doesn't mean that every single time the whole thing is downloaded, right? If you have it cached, then obviously it will go a lot faster. No thin client for client side, yeah. There is obviously, if your client cannot run WebAssembly, then you cannot run or display a web app written in Client Side Blazor. That means you have devices like smart TVs or smart fridges or whatever that have browser support, or some console browsers if you're a gamer. If they don't support WebAssembly, then you cannot browse to and use your web application from that browser. Whether that is a problem for you or your project, you have to decide, obviously, and then make that decision before you start the project. Another thing is debugging options are limited. Yeah, debugging, if you have a server-side app, well, debugging is very simple and easy, right? Because it's just like any other .NET Core app. You can just, run it, set breakpoints and hit breakpoints. When it came out, Client Side Blazor did not have that functionality, but there have been released debugging tools recently that allow you to also do that. So it's a few extra steps that you have to take to make it happen, make it possible. It's not exactly on the same level of accessibility yet as Server Side Blazor debugging, but it is possible. The other cool thing about debugging is if you really want to debug something or a piece of code or part of your Blazor app and you want to just make it simple, you can always just spin up a server-side app, copy that code over, debug it, and copy it back into your client-side app. So that's always an option too. Server-side, fully compatible with .NET libraries or tools. Well, yeah, anything that you have done or have been used in the past, even if it's older, from older .NET technologies, as long as it's compatible with .NET, you can use it. It has the same syntax as client-side Blazor, as I just said, so you can just copy over anything from client-side to server-side or vice versa and use it in the respective projects. The heavy lifting is done on the server. So when you have calculations that take a while to do or require a lot of calculations to do, and you don't want the browser to do all the heavy lifting, you can put that on the server. Just let the server do all that, and you're just going to take care of whatever the results are to display. And we'll see that in today's coding exercise too, what that means once you deploy a Blazor app. The download is significantly smaller. Well, that shouldn't come as a surprise because on a server-side hosted Blazor app, the only thing you're downloading is HTML and a little bit of JavaScript to the browser because that's all that the server gives you through the SignalR connection. Everything else is done and calculated and computed on the server. And it works, therefore, with all thin clients too, right? Every browser that understands HTML will be able to display a server-side hosted Blazor app because they're still just getting HTML in a sense to display and don't even know on the client side that this actually comes from a Blazor app. Could be a Vue app or a React app or anything else, right? It's just getting HTML at that point. The cons for server-side is, well, we have to worry about network latency and delays in the responses. Well, because you have a constant connection to your server, it also means your app cannot run if you have no internet connection. So as soon as you lose internet, you lose functionality of your app, obviously. And if your connection is bad and it takes a while to communicate back and forth, that might, incur some delays in the responsiveness of your app. So if you have mouse over effects for tooltips, for instance, or if you have click events and those sort of things, those might be delayed half a second or longer, depending on your internet connection if it's really bad. Obviously, in a regular standard setting, there's none of that. But I'm just going worst case just before you lose internet connection, basically. That's an area you will see some lag and delays occur. The app uses more bandwidth. Yeah, that shouldn't come as a surprise either, because instead of having an initial download to download the app to the client, you have a constant connection to the server, right? So every time you do something, every time you interact with the app, it goes back and forth through the Signal R connection to the client, from the client to the server. And that means every single thing is a two-way road with data sent back and forth. So if you have an app that has a lot of tooltips, for instance, every mouse move, every time you move just a pixel over a control that has a tooltip, for instance, and you need to display that, well, it's a two-way connection to get that information, right? And every time you click something, every time you change to a different page and so on, always uses bandwidth. So if the app runs for a while, or if it's a business app that runs all day, you incur a lot more bandwidth. Now, again, in most cases or most scenarios, that's not something to worry about, but just something to be aware of. The other disadvantage, if you want to see this as a disadvantage, is you have to have .NET installed on the server. So you have to have a server that understands and can run .NET. You cannot have a Mac OS server, for instance, if it doesn't support or understand .NET. So I'm not sure if that actually is a disadvantage or just a requirement, but anyways, it's on the list to be aware of. The simultaneous connections that you can have to your server, however, can be a problem. And that is due to the fact that Signal R only supports so many concurrent parallel connections to the server. So every server has to serve everyone that addresses it. Every client that serves that page up needs to be served through that Signal R connection. That Signal R connection has its limits. It depends on your settings and what your how much you're paying for it, basically, wherever you host it. But the more connections it is, the more expensive, obviously, it gets. Plus, at some point, the number of connections is exhausted, right? Even if you were to say, yeah, I want to pay more, at some point you can't pay more. At some point there is a limit. And then you have to implement a different architectural strategy to alleviate that problem, right? Then you'll have to replicate your server so that the replication of that server, whenever its original one is exhausted in connections, can serve additional requests. So if you have, and we're not talking about some small website that has a few hundred people serving up to it, right? We're talking about a website, let's say something in the size of Expedia or something that's used all around the world by hundreds of thousands of people potentially at the same time, right? Then we're going to have that problem. As a regular business app, you're probably not going to run into that issue. But if you are working on a project that you think it's going to be worldwide hit, everybody's going to want it, everybody's going to use it, you should think about this early and test it out early. How many concurrent connections can your server serve up on the highest level to the users, and where is that limit? And once you reach that limit, how do you progress from there, right? How do you replicate your server and make sure additional requests that the original one can't serve up are handled by your backup? You don't have this problem, obviously, with client side, right? Because if 100,000 people serve up a client side Blazor app, well, 100,000 people are going to download it to their device, download the runtime, and going to run it on their devices. So that is not a limit at all in the client side scenario. Now, that's enough for the pros and cons of the two. We're going to create up a Blazor app now. We're going to start with a server side. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the server side app. We're going to do something very simple. We're going to create the standard default app, basically, that Visual Studio gives you. We're going to add something to it, just a little combo box with some data in it. We select something from it and see the response on the screen. And then we're going to do the exact same thing client side and copy over our code to prove and see that, yeah, it's the same code. We don't have to change anything code-wise for it. And then we're going to publish both of them and see how they behave once they're published. And then we're going to add a functionality to both of our apps that requires some, let's call it heavy lifting, right? Something that runs for a little bit, and see how our deployed versions of that application behaves in those scenarios. So we're going to create a new project in Visual Studio. I'm going to select the Blazor app, and once you select the Blazor app, it lets you choose if you want the Blazor Server app or a Blazor WebAssembly app, which is the client-side app. I'm going to start with the Server app and create it, and I've already done this. So here is my Techfest Blazor Server app. It's the standard application that is created by Visual Studio, and nothing has been added to it yet. And I can run this, and it should serve up my browser, and I will see my Hello World app, right? So this is the Blazor app that comes up, and the Blazor app that is the default app is the same server side and client side. So you'll see it looks exactly the same, has the same two functionality. It has the counter where you can click and it increases the counter, and it has that fetch data where it gives you some weather information, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add something to this, as I said, and for that we're going to in our folder menu, we're going to our navigation menu, Razor page, and in our navigation menu, which should be under the shared folder, we're just going to add another list item to our navigation page here, and we're going to call this one our superhero page. We're going to have some superheroes loaded in a combo box, and then we pick someone from there. So this should just add another list item to that list on the navigation bar on our side. Obviously, we don't have that page just yet, so that's the next thing that we're going to do. We're going to create a superhero Razor page. So for here, we're going to go into Pages, and we're going to add a Razor component. And by the way, Razor components always have to have a capital letter to start with. And we're going to call this hero.razor. And we're going to have our hero component right here. Now, in our hero component, we at the very top need to give it our link description that we posted or wrote in our navigation menu. And in our case, that would be superhero, right? This is what we said our link will navigate to. So now with this empty Razor page that we have, checking the time, we have our navigation menu expanded by another entry. And if we click it, we'll see our empty page that only says hero on it. There's nothing else on it just yet, but this is all we have at this point. Now, in Razor pages, you have your HTML code first, and then you have your code section after. This is the typical layout for Razor pages. Whether you like this or not, you don't have to follow that, right? You can also say, I want all my HTML in one page and all my code in the other. So you can take your code out into a CS file and just include that CS file into your Razor page and have a clear separation of your UI and your functionality, if that's what you prefer. What I prefer is it depends on the size of my Razor components. If it's a fairly small component, as the one that we're doing today, for instance, then yeah, I'll keep it the way it's suggested with my UI code and the functionality in the same file, because it's all in one then. But if I have components that are fairly exhaustive in functionality and that have hundreds or potentially thousands of lines of functionality code, then I'll keep my Razor page small and simple with just the UI code, and all my code section is put into a separate file that I just include in my Razor page. So it's up to you, however you'd like to do this. Now in our page, what we want to do is we want to show something. So I don't want to bore you with typing all this up. So I'm just going to copy this in that I have prepared. And this is very simple. We're going to have a button that upon clicking loads our heroes. And we're going to have a combo box right after with some heroes that are selected in there or available in there. And we're going to pick something from that list and display it in our section right underneath. What do we need in our code? Well, first of all, we'll need an object for our superheroes. So we're going to just add a new class to our project. We're going to call it hero.cs. And in our hero, we're going to just give it two properties. Just going to give it a name and an ID. And then in our page, we will create the properties that we need. We need a list that hosts all of our heroes. And we need something that keeps track of our selected superhero. Let me get rid of that namespace here. So this is what's going to take care of our list and our selected one. And then we will need our function that loads our superheroes. And this function, as displayed on here, happens whenever something is changed in our combo box in our select. What we're going to do is we're going to just add a bunch of superheroes to our list. And again, in the code I prepared, I had a different namespace, so I'll have to just get rid of that and we should be fine. And looks like we are not fine. I don't know, sometimes it's a little bit slow with correcting underlines. So it's not always correct when it says there's a problem. So we'll see. We're just gonna go with it for now. If it is, I have it prepared also, so that wouldn't be a problem. And then we also have the option to, or we have to implement our function for when the hero is selected. And so we not only load our heroes, we also select our heroes. And we don't need that just yet. So we select our superhero based on the ID that was tracked in the combo box. And yeah, I think if I'm not missing anything, that should be it. It's not sure yet what hero is. I'm not, let's see. It should know what it is. All right, we're just gonna see if it is complaining. Well, like I said, I have it prepared beforehand also, so can just switch over to the other one if need be. yeah, I don't want to bore you with, I don't know, can't see it on the first glance right now, what it doesn't understand about my hero. So no matter, we're just going to switch over to the other instance of Visual Studio that I have open, where obviously it's not a problem. Exactly the same code. And we're going to run this, and we'll see that we will have our superheroes loaded in our combo box. And here we have our superhero, and here we can click our load heroes, and we can select any of these superheroes from that list, and it will display the superhero that we have selected down there. Now, there's one more thing that I have added to this code, and that is a very exhaustive function to get some prime numbers. I want to simulate some execution that takes a while on the server, so I'm going to add that to my superhero name. I want to see the highest prime number lower than 50,000, just to see how long it takes for this to execute. And if I select a superhero, you can see there's a delay, maybe half a second or whatever that it takes here to do that. And it will display that superhero that I've selected down there with that prime number added to its name. That is just something that I added because I want to see a direct comparison between client side and server side execution on that. All right, so now that we have our server side application right here, we can do the same thing again in our client side. And well, before that, let's just go over how we can deploy it, because that's interesting too. If we say publish, it's going to ask you, first, if you do it the first time, it's going to ask you how to go through your Azure account, which Azure subscription you want to publish it to, and what resource you want to publish it to. For those of you who have published .NET Core or ASP.NET apps before, that should be very familiar. The publication goes very simple. Once that is set up, you just click publish, and you will have your link on your Azure website's domain. In my case, it's Blazor Techfest server. That is where it goes. And here is the live link. So if you were to browse to that link, you would get the exact same thing. So that website is now live. Blazor Techfest server.azurewebsites.net. And if you go to superhero and you load your superheroes, then you can select one. And you will see that the server calculates it in, I think it's right around the 1 second delay mark. When you select one, about a second later, it will display whatever you have selected right below it in combination with that highest prime number that you're calculating. So with that in mind, we're going to do the same thing client side now. And again, I'm going to bring this up as a Visual Studio project. And we should see side by side. Once it's loaded, just give me a second. All right, I'm gonna make this half the size of my screen so you can see and compare. So this should be half my screen. And this one should be the other. Yep, right here. All right. And I should probably make it smaller so we can see or compare the code side by side. All right. Now, this is my client side project. This is my server side project. It has the exact same code files, right? It has the superhero. Razor page, it has the superhero class that I have here, and in the navigation menu, I have the entry for my page that I want to navigate to. So the code is exactly the 100% same. There is no difference. I just took it from here and copied it over into here. The only difference is that there is a few architectural differences in client side versus server side. There's a few components or files that do not exist in one over the other. And that is really the only thing you need to be aware of when you use third-party controls, for instance. If you use third-party controls like charts from third-party vendors, you can't just copy code over, add those controls and think it works, because you have to configure those controls, and the configure files for those controls, for instance, are different between the two projects. So you'll have to go to documentation and say, or read up where you have to configure your controls in which file, because some files do not exist in client side that do exist in server side, and vice versa. So if I were to run my client side app, then it should bring up my browser as well. And we can see that in the browser that's running local. Takes a little bit longer because obviously it has to get all the assemblies first. Then we have here our superhero. We can load our heroes into the combo box. Then we pick something, and as soon as we picked, it waits a while, right? Because now it is doing the heavy lifting, right? Now the heavy lifting is done by the browser, not done on the server. And even though my server was local before, you can see there's a significant difference, right? And also the responsiveness. While my server is working, my app stays responsive, right? It just waits for the response from the server and then updates the UI. Versus here, if I pick something, my app right now is frozen, right? There is nothing I can do or click because my browser is actually calculating and doing all the heavy lifting. So this is one of the big disadvantages. And this took, what, 5 seconds or so to calculate that prime number. So you can see there is a significant difference in speed in client side versus server side. Now, this is just when I run it local, right? So let's compare this when it's deployed. So the same thing goes when you deploy client side, right? You just have your project and you say publish, and then when you want to publish it, it takes you through, let's move this a little over, takes you through the deployment process. Again, you just say you want to publish it, however your Azure subscription is set up, or if you publish it somewhere else, it's a Docker container somewhere, or on Amazon Cloud or Google Cloud or wherever. However, wherever it goes, you will have a URL that you can navigate to. So mine is deploying right now. Now, if you, again, this is the client side app, and this is live as well. So if you were to navigate to a Blazor Techfest client test.azurewebsites.net, you will see this application running live on the internet as well. Now you can go to superhero, what we just did. We're going to load all our heroes, which goes instant, right? This is not a very heavy calculation or computation that we have to go through. But then once we select something, let's select Wonder Woman. We'll see again, this is now running client side, right? So now my client has to do that, and it took significantly longer. Like I would compare it to like a second, maybe 1.5 seconds. Maybe like 4. This was more like 4 to 5 seconds. So it's significantly different, right? So there's a significant performance difference in client side versus server side. If we compare this in directly, go over here. And where have I published it? To this page. If I publish this here, there's my browser. Then I have my client, and here I have my server. And if I open my server deployment, I load my heroes. If I select one, it's maybe a second, right? Maybe a second to bring up the superhero with that prime number added to it. So you can see this is significantly faster than this. Right now here, I'm stuck for 5 seconds for it to wait and finish displaying Spider-Man with that prime number in the end. So yeah, and that is basically the big difference between client-side and server-side Blazor development. In terms of performance, there is another thing you have to be aware of. Any heavy lifting, calculation or computation-wise that you want to do, obviously should be on the server, right? If that is something that you or your app depends on, you, in very rare instances, want your browser to have to do that, right? This is not something you want to worry about, especially because your app, as we can see, doesn't stay responsive if it has to do that. However, there is instances where your browser will do a lot better, and that is if you do any graphical development or programming, or if you create components or UI charts or some of that sort, which can translate into WebAssembly and that have to have direct responsiveness with interactions, right? If you have a chart, for instance, with hundreds or thousands of data points on it, and every single mouse move goes over a data point that needs to display the X and the Y or the value of it, or if you have a curve and you want to just mouse over the curve at any point, and that curve needs to display the value at that particular instance. This is all calculation that, if it is, written well and calculated well, that WebAssembly code will run very fast, and that control will be very fast. Versus if that was something to be done on the server, we'll have the exact opposite scenario, where every single time you move or is something is calculated that is expensive UI calculation, your server will have to not only do it, but communicate in 2 ways back with your client. And in that instance, your server-side application will be a lot slower than your client-side application. So again, if you have something that is performance-driven, be aware of what type of performance it is and where this performance really needs to perform or needs to be optimized, right? If this is something that needs to be optimized because it's data crunching, data calculation, that sort of stuff, well, put it on the server, make it a server-side app. If this is something that is UI-driven, user interaction-driven, display-driven, right? Or if you have a game, for instance, with a lot of visual changes based on mouse input, with your keyboard or with clicking and mouse move, then this is the obvious choice for a client-side app, because then you don't want all of that go back and forth all the time between client and server. This will take quite a lot of time to go back and forth, and your server-side app will behave or execute a lot slower. We're almost out of time, so that's about it for today. I hope everybody has seen and gotten to know a few details about client-side versus server-side Blazor development and deployment, and seen one instance where you can see how client-side Blazor apps are slower than server-side Blazor apps if we have to do heavy lifting. And again, that heavy lifting that we did wasn't very complicated. It was just a prime number calculation. So you can imagine if this goes beyond, this wasn't even the recursive function. If this goes beyond that into a 100 or 1,000-fold recursive function or cluster of functions, you can just imagine how this would not be a very good user experience if this would have been calculated on the client. We have 5 minutes left, so that's about it for today. Let me know if there are any questions, and I will answer them to the best of my abilities. Let's see.
There have not been any questions published to the Q&A, so if you got anything, go ahead and publish that now. We can wait for just a minute to see if any come in. All
All
right,
right.
I do have one question for you. It says, do you think that this will overtake JavaScript in popularity?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I mean, it's brand new, right? Full stack C# and Blazor development just was released this year. It's a little early to say whether this will take over. I don't think it's going to take over because JavaScript is so popular in web development. There's so many frameworks out there, from Angular to Vue to React and more. It's not going to overtake it. No, I don't think it's going to overtake it, but I think it is the closest thing to a competitor for it. And I mean, it's hard to say. When React came out and people were thinking, hey, is this going to, overtake Angular at some point? People would have said, no, Angular is so big. And now if you look at Stack Overflow and popularities and stars, React has overtaken Angular. So it's hard to say. It really just depends on the community. If people really want to do full stack C# development, and if so, then yeah, I mean, I see it rising, and I see that it's going to be a serious competitor to JavaScript-based frameworks and JavaScript web development. But overtake, I think that would be a far stretch to say it will overtake it.
Got one more question. It says, can you make the code available for download?
Yes, I can. How would I, is there a way I can publish this for everyone, or how would I go about this? Or should I email out a link for it to be downloaded, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, you can send out a link. Do you have an email that you wouldn't mind people reaching out to you directly on?
Yes, there is. Yeah, if you want, let's do it that way. If you want to get the code base for this, you can just email me. Here is my presenter contact. If you go to codemag.com under people, you can find me as well, but here's my email address. If you email me here, then I will certainly email you that project, or both projects if you want, and you can run them directly and compare them on your own.
Okay, so the question was asking if they're possibly on GitHub, so I assume that if it is, you'll send that GitHub link as it is available, or if it's available.
Correct.
I got one more comment. Said, thank you for a great presentation. Within the server side create, is there an ability to just set it up as an API versus web pages, etc.?
Well, if you set it up as an API, then you, in essence, will just create a server side app, right? If you just want some API for to call from other apps, then well, you can create a .NET Core app to do that. You don't need Blazor for it. Blazor really just is defining what the front end in that essence looks like, right? In the back end, it's gonna be a .NET Core app if you want it as an API. But if you want it as an API, then you don't need Blazor in that essence. And if you set it up as a server side Blazor app, then well, some sort it is an API, right? Because you have everything set up as a .NET Core application anyways, and you're just serving the resulting HTML to whatever client serves it up.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have today. So thank you for attending today's session, and Otto, thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
The recording of the session will be available at HoustonTechFest.com soon. We hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual Houston Tech Fest, and you guys have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everyone.